Chapter 5 English Canada's Response to Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow. In case you think you stand alone in your reaction to what has been done to this Canada, I want to use this last chapter to give you a small sample from many hundreds of letters I have received after my book Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow was published. Although most of these letters are now 10 years old, their message is just as valid now as it was then, or perhaps more so. Dear Jock, in dealing with the history of Quebec, let us not lose sight of the aims and ambitions of that early clerical separatist, Canon Lionel Gruel, who advocated, during Trudeau's formative years, the separate and independent state of Laurentia. I am old enough to recall those years and the propaganda to which we were then subjected. Of course, many of the canon's plans were lost in the thunder of other canons. Hitler was rising to power, and the Nazis were on the march. The displeasures of Canon Gruel were very small potatoes by comparison, and he got lost in the shuffle until the war came to a close in 1945. However, I can remember as a teenager in Quebec visiting the Christian Brothers School in Saint-Agathe-des-Monts with intent to enroll in a commercial course for the summer months. On arrival at the school, I found it deserted. The pupils were off on holiday. The brothers were nowhere to be found. Still, the school and its classrooms were open, and I took the opportunity to inspect the facilities it offered. In the first classroom I entered, I found the first indications that, as an English Canadian, I would not be welcome aboard. Over the blackboards that stretched across the room, both front and back, were posted two carefully crafted signs. The one in front declared, Notre Église est la seule, our church is the only one. Over the blackboard at the aft was written, En bas les Anglais, to hell with the English. As the son of the local Anglican clergyman, and he a Londoner by birth, I felt that I had 2 strikes against me before I ever began, and reluctantly decided that if I was ever to pursue a course in commerce, it would not be with the assistance of the Christian Brothers. That, I might add, took place in 1934, some few years back, when Trudeau was a snotty-nosed little brat in short pants chanting these happy epithets at the direction of his Christian brothers. May I presume to suggest that you also point out how really insidious this French-only fact really is? Take, for example, the case of my godson's mother. Born and raised in Montreal, she is the daughter of a French-Canadian father and a maritime English mother. During her elementary schooling in Quebec, she attended a convent school where she learned to read, speak, and write absolutely flawless French. After graduating from high school, she entered the labor force of Quebec where, because she was so proficient in both French and English, she was classified as bilingual and was offered any number of interesting and lucrative positions. In 1969, she met the love of her life and married him, a boy from the suburbs of London, England. Once the honeymoon was over, she decided to return to work. However, this time there was a vast difference. It took no time at all to advise her that she was English-speaking only, and she was denied access to a number of attractive positions. She and her husband are now residents of Ontario, but even here, Canada Manpower does not recognize the fact that she is totally bilingual. There is no job in the public service open to her unless, of course, she wishes to use her maiden name, and this, God bless her, she will not do. Another fact that should not be forgotten when discussing our present Governor-General is the deplorable incident that occurred in Toronto last year when it was made known at a gala function which Léger was attending that the Governor-General does not wish decorations to be worn, and the Assembly was treated to the embarrassing sight of watching stately veteran officers removing their decorations to stuff them in pockets or the purses of their wives. Of course, the explanation given was that the aide-de-camp had misunderstood His Excellency's directive, and that was that. But you can rest assured that it was no mistake. As far as I'm concerned, I will wear my decorations in full view of Jules Léger whenever I feel so inclined, and if he doesn't like it, he may try to rip them from my chest if he will. Might it not be in order to note the fact that French people sing one version of O Canada while we give voice to another? We declare for all to hear that we are standing on guard for Canada. The French advertise the fact that they will defend their hearths and their rights. They say nothing about Canada as a whole. This seems to me a less patriotic attitude and probably accounts for their dubious showing in the 2 world wars. For a change of pace, I would like to include a lengthy letter written by a thoughtful, genuine, made-in-France Frenchman with his reactions to what has been happening to Canada under Mr. Trudeau. Dear Sir, I came to this country in 1972 as a landed immigrant from France, and since then I have been a witness to the degradation of relations between English and French Canadians that Mr. Trudeau was supposed to cure using the miraculous recipe of bilingualism. When I started in Montreal 5 years ago, each distinct community, the English and the French, were respecting each other and, although distant, were living in peaceful coexistence. Today, after more than 2 centuries, the hostility and resentment have never been so great, and the exodus of Anglophones from the province of Quebec emerges to be a serious matter. In 1972 in Montreal, you could speak either French or English without triggering hatred or racism. You could send your children to be educated in the language of your choice. Rather than healing the wounds and bringing justice to both communities, Mr. Trudeau has achieved so far no goal but to exasperate both communities to a point where irreparable damage could be done to this country. Mr. Trudeau does not realize that the first component of the unity of any country is, of course, the language. If this unity is not at the level of the country, it must be preserved in subunits, which are the provinces, like it is done in a similar way in Switzerland. In that country, the laws indicate quite clearly that citizens cannot request to be serviced in any other language than the one in common use in the particular area in which they are. This does not prevent anybody to speak German, French, Italian, Chinese, Turkish, or whatever they like, but the limits are very well set, and any trouble or language right overlapping is so warded off. I have been wondering why it is not so in Canada. How come the federal government has not understood this simple, basic fact? The reaction is not visible right now because Mr. Trudeau has so well sold his stuff that people just do not have any argument to oppose without being called bigot or anti-Canadian. At the time of the large emigration waves to America, the unity of the new nation called U.S. was still very fragile. The insistence placed by the U.S. government on the use of one language only was, of course, motivated by obvious reasons. This, with some other factors, has led to a very strong nation which is proud of itself. In Canada, those efforts toward one unique language are, on the contrary, discouraged by the Canadian government that declares Canada to be a multicultural nation. How silly and how dangerous. I have always been surprised that, as a Frenchman, I feel very welcome in the USA every time I go there. Whereas in Canada, my telling that I am French, although I am Canadian as well, seems to trigger a strange reaction which is to turn off and away my new acquaintances almost immediately. In those conditions, how does it feel to be a Canadian? I am still not very keen on staying in this country for obvious reasons, although I am now fluent in both languages. This country seems to be so unstable and its future too jeopardized by silly politics for me to plan a very long stay. What motivation does Mr. Trudeau have? Like many French Canadians, he reacts as a colonial toward English Canadians, Americans, the Queen, and everything which reminds him of former political or economic domination. He tries to instill, unconsciously, feelings in the population against England and the U.S., and succeeds so well that many Canadians are starting to think that they really have a poor share of the deal. I should like to congratulate you on the job you did in writing this book. The foregoing letter deals with ideas. This next letter deals with the reality of bilingualism in action. Dear Sir, I have just recently read your book Bilingual Today, French Tomorrow, and I am deeply shocked by what I have read. I, too, have had some experience with French Canadians, but this was 10 years ago, and I suppose conditions would be even worse now. I belong to a trade union, Steamfitters and Plumbers, which is an international union Canada-wide. Business was slack in Toronto, but the Sudbury, Ontario local was calling for help. From Sudbury, French locals get the call first, and when they cannot supply, the call is broadened, so we get the call in Toronto. Needing the work, I picked up a travel card and went to Sudbury. I left early and slept in my car, so I would be at the union office early when they opened. Well, needless to say, the language was all French, which I don't understand, and as a result, everybody except me was interviewed and cleared for a job, including all the ones that came in after me. Then the business agent asked me what I wanted, in perfect English, and when I explained, he told me there would be no further interviews until 1:30 p.m. I came in at 1:30 p.m. and was told that the business agent would not be back until the following morning. The next day, it was 2:30 p.m. before I got an interview and a work card to go and work at Temagami, which was over 80 miles away. So I could not drop my travel card until the next day, as the office at Temagami was closed when I got there. In all, it took me 3 days to start work. The steamfitters that were in the Sudbury office in the first morning started work in Temagami the following morning. By this time, I was beginning to see the light. I had heard before that this condition existed, but it was my first experience with it. I was given all the dirty and dangerous jobs on the project, and nobody would speak to me in English if they could possibly avoid it. I felt like a foreigner in my own country. When the duck season opened, they found an excuse to go on strike for a week. A few weeks later, the moose season opened, and they found another excuse to go on strike. In the meantime, I was 300 miles from home and could not afford to pay room and board without work, so I quit the job. The same brothers used to come to Toronto when our local needed help and were always well treated and given every consideration, but of course they always spoke English then. I would like to give you a little advice. You will probably in the not-too-distant future be approached for radio interviews. Unless you have all the questions to be asked in advance, I would refuse, because there is no doubt they are going to be after your hide, and you will realize how they can twist these interviews to their own advantage to cut down on the impact of your book. In other words, they would cry bigot. Readers may be curious as to why the unions provided no opposition to the Trudeau government as it systematically rid Canada's federal civil service of its English-speaking workers. On assuming power, one of Trudeau's first moves was to provide $10 million to the Canadian Labour Congress. The following letter excerpt helps explain what resulted. Quote, I recently had occasion to return to Ottawa, at which time I visited the Public Service Union headquarters. Sure enough, I found a staff of French Canadians representing all government employees. Consequently, our Government Employees Union is unable to represent the English segment, and so Trudeau naturally has the union's enthusiastic support for his French takeover. Update, March 1989. My book, Enough, was published in June 1988. The book is now due for reprinting, and so I want to take this opportunity to make some observations on what has happened during this past year. Bill C-72, the legislation whereby every resource of the Canadian federal government is now being brought to bear to make Canada a completely French-speaking nation, was passed by Parliament on the 7th of July 1988. The ink was barely dry when our Canadian Secretary of State, the Quebec separatist Lucien Bouchard, publicly assured Bourassa and Quebec that the new Official Languages Act would have no bearing on Quebec's Bill 101 and an all-French Quebec, and that the new law was designed solely to advance French across English-speaking Canada. Shortly thereafter, the Commissioner for Official Languages, d'Iberville-Fortier, stated that he saw nothing incongruous about Quebec's imposition of the French language in the workplace for all in Quebec, while at the same time the new Official Languages Act, in concert with Trudeau's Bill of Rights, is intended to bring about the use of French in the workplace across the rest of Canada. Some 40 progressive Conservative MPs who were opposed to Bill C-72 were cajoled into line by Mr. Mulroney, and in the end only a handful of MPs had the courage to vote against the bill. More than half of our MPs absented themselves for the vote count, a demonstration of the spinelessness of our English-speaking members of Parliament that was equaled only by the passage of Ontario's French Language Services Act in Toronto 2 years before, where the same proportion of MPPs absented themselves as Ontario's government put the entire province of Ontario into total French-Canadian control. As a direct result of the passage of Bill C-72, hundreds of French-language Canadian government and Crown Corporation offices are now being opened in cities across English-speaking Canada. Where there is as yet no significant demand for French services, there soon will be as Francophone colonists are moving into English-speaking Canada by the scores of thousands. Meanwhile, existing Canadian government and Crown Corporation offices across Canada are also being converted to French-Canadian staffs just as fast as excuses can be found for dumping the remaining English-speaking incumbents. At this moment, Air Canada, Via Rail, CNR, the Canadian Postal Corporation, Central Mortgage and Housing, Petro-Canada, the RCMP, and the whole of the Canadian military are being moved totally into French-Canadian hands even faster than vacancies can be made available, and so are all their management and supervision levels. As well, all travel services, hotel services, currency exchanges, car rental services, restaurant, food, ferry, and hospital services are being targeted. In Ontario, under the French Language Services Act, recruiting from Quebec to fill Ontario government offices and the Ontario Provincial Police has accelerated to the point where hiring from Quebec is in some cases being done over the telephone without even the formality of personal interviews. Throughout Ontario, just as with the federal government offices in Ottawa and across Canada, provincial government offices are being converted to the French language, and the remaining English-speaking incumbents are being intimidated into either quitting or marking time until retirement. For these measures, Ontario's Premier Peterson and former Premier Davis should be recognized for what they are. They have made a mockery of the thousands of Canadian servicemen who fought and died or were maimed for life to preserve this country in 2 world wars. Exactly the same can be said of all but a handful of members of Parliament who have succeeded in selling out this country in Ottawa during these last 20 years. If not guilty of treason, they are most certainly guilty of dereliction of trust. On December 15, 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that Quebec's sign laws were illegal. Quebec's Premier Bourassa responded by producing Bill 178, and from that point on, French-Canadian mobs in Quebec have been incited to anti-English rioting, to Canadian flag burning, arson, and window breaking, while both the Quebec police and the Canadian media politely looked the other way. In Quebec, the battle cry is now Quebec for French Canadians. Not long prior to the Supreme Court's decision on Bill 101, another Supreme Court ruling resulted in the following directive from the Attorney General of Manitoba: repeal of private acts in the province of Manitoba. To comply with an order of the Supreme Court of Canada, all private acts of Manitoba must be translated into French and reenacted in both languages on or before December 31st, 1990. Any private act which is in English only will not be valid after that date. Examples of some types of organizations incorporated by private act are charities, hospitals, religious groups, private educational institutions and associations, and certain businesses, particularly of a financial nature. That ruling forcing the reincorporation in French of businesses in Manitoba will also be brought into effect from Newfoundland to BC before the next 2 years are out. Where then do we stand? At this moment, Canada is already, for all practical purposes, a French-speaking nation. Look at the evidence. Our federal government is now under total French control and is being converted to the French language just as fast as can be done. The same applies to our federally owned crown corporations. Our military and our national police force are being converted to French-Canadian entities as quickly as the remaining English-speaking Canadians can be bullied into quitting or coerced into early retirement. Today, Canada's Parliament is opened first in the French language by a French-Canadian zealot who purports to represent the Queen, but who in fact represents only expansionist French Canada. The Winter Olympic Games in Calgary, which, like Expo 86 in Vancouver, were designed to get Western Canadians accustomed to their new French milieu, were opened first in French by that same French-Canadian zealot. The last time the Queen was present in Canada, she was directed to open Parliament in the French language first. Our Canadian representation in our embassies abroad, at international events, and at the United Nations is also in French by French Canadians. Privately owned businesses across Canada are being even more forcefully bribed and coerced into French Canadian hiring, French language usage, and French-only promotion policies. Today, the control of half our provincial government bureaucracies is already in French-Canadian hands. I cite Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, PEI, and Manitoba. Today, in those 5 provinces, all government paperwork goes out in French as well as English, except in Quebec, where it is French only. All signs relating to provincial government holdings or property are now being produced in French as well as English, except in Quebec, where again they are in French only. In our towns across English-speaking Canada, the French invasion from Quebec and from a 20-year-old French-Canadian designed immigration policy is now becoming evident. In northern and eastern Ontario, the Francophone hiring policies for government offices, for schools, for hospitals, for stores and businesses state quite blatantly that the goal is not bilingualism but French hiring, French promotion, and French control of the whole, the provinces, the cities, and the towns. In our cities, the French invasion is not yet so obvious, but it is there, and it is accelerating under the new Official Languages Act, which could be more properly termed the Official Frenchification Act. In the cities, from Halifax to Victoria, the federal government-funded Francophone colonists are directed to stick to themselves, to send their children to their own French schools, to listen to their own French radio programs, to watch their own French television channels, to form their own societies in their own Francophone cultural centers, only to emerge to demand more and more services in the French language. The whole scam is nothing more or less than a foreign invasion, with we the vanquished paying the entire shot. And how are brainwashed, apathetic English-speaking Canadians responding to this invasion? Instead of telling Quebec and French Canada to go to hell, we rush out and enroll our children in French immersion schooling. Meanwhile, the courts and the Secretary of State continue to drop one bomb after another on what remains of English-speaking Canada. The office of the Commissioner for Official Languages has been on a war footing for 2 years now by his own definition. On December 3, 1988, the Charlottetown Guardian announced the details for a new combined Francophone school and community centre for Charlottetown. The federal government will pay 75% of the $7.1 million construction costs and will pay the operating costs of $300,000 per year for the first 5 years. The province of PEI will pay the balance and pick up the operating costs after 5 years. The same article reported that only 954 residents in Charlottetown had French as a mother tongue and only 210 used it as a first language. You can be sure that most, if not all, of the 210 would have been imported by Ottawa under federal government decentralization. What is happening in Charlottetown is happening in every city across Canada. In Kitchener, where I live, and which was originally a German-Canadian community, French is now available either full or part-time on 5 of the channels brought in by Rogers Cable TV. At the Via Rail Station, every public announcement is now made in French as well as English, and the same will soon apply to our bus station. In Queen's Park, the seat of the Ontario government, land titles may now be deposited in French only, with no translation required. French spoken in the legislature appears in French in the Hansard, the record of Ontario's Parliament, with the result that 90% of Ontarians can't read what their legislators are saying. The Commissioner for Official Languages is very pleased with Ontario's Premier Peterson. In his 1986 annual report, Commissioner Fortier stated, "The constitutional entrenchment of French as an official language in Ontario, which the Commissioner publicly supports, appears to be only a matter of time. Franco-Ontarian organizations must carefully prepare for this final step." And who are these Franco-Ontarian organizations? The main umbrella organization is the Association Canadienne Française de l'Ontario, which through its 22 regional ACFOs and 18 affiliated provincial organizations represents youth groups, parent-teacher associations, professional organizations, and cultural and social clubs. The Office of Francophone Affairs, Ontario, has published a directory which lists over 3,000 organizations serving Ontario's Francophones, all of them funded by federal and provincial tax dollars. And what applies to Francophone organizations and funding in Ontario applies to each of our provinces. To show you how French language training has been used to force English-speaking Canadians out of federal government service during these last 20 years, I want to quote the experiences of one individual. In 1974, I had my first official day in a permanent position as secretary in the Canadian International Development Agency Training Division. It was also my first day of intensive French language training. After 6 months, 2 schools, and 24 teachers, they discovered that I had no aptitude for the language. Totally exhausted, I returned to work where over 100 positions had been phased out, including mine. During my 6 months on language training, there were many other changes made in designated positions, making it more difficult to find Anglophone positions and placing my position in jeopardy. Personnel was being staffed with French-speaking persons who were making more and more positions bilingual. Since bilingualism is so widespread, it is impossible to advance as an Anglophone even with a high quality of expertise. All directors found it necessary to have bilingual or francophone secretaries. Policies were being written in French and translated into English. Meetings were being held in French, making it impossible for competent Anglophone secretaries to take minutes of meetings or even communicate at a higher level. Many of the men I worked with were having breakdowns, heart attacks, and marriage breakups, all in the name of bilingualism. My experience is typical of the situation. Everyone has a story similar to mine, either as a personal experience or the experience of a member of their family or a close friend. I am presently employed at National Defence, where the same problem now exists. In summary, there are two official languages in Canada and a definite imbalance in favor of francophones. I feel like a stranger in my own country. End of letter. In the course of the last 8 months, I have gone out to speak by invitation to 20 organizations across Canada that are concerned with what is happening to this country. On the last such instance, in a town in eastern Ontario, I stayed overnight with a family in which the wife works for a department of the Ontario government. This town is 28% French and 72% English-speaking. During our conversations, the wife told me that the office in which she worked originally employed both French and English-speaking Canadians. The working language was English and everyone got along well. But then the Ontario French Language Services Act was passed, and one of the French Canadians in the office was promoted to supervisor. From that moment on, and to this day, that supervisor speaks French only. And when my friend, who is now one of the only 2 remaining English-speaking Canadians in the office, speaks to the supervisor, she is replied to in French. Everyone else in the office, except her one remaining companion, now also speaks French only. My friend, who is an attractive, intelligent person, describes going to work every day as pure hell, but she says she doesn't dare leave because she can't hope to get another job in the whole town because all jobs in that town now go to French Canadians only. Further, the provincial government has advised that no more Anglos would be hired by the provincial government in that town. I asked her to let me use her name here, but she refused out of fear of losing the job she has, such as it is. This town is in Ontario, the province that was the heartland of English-speaking Canada before Davis and Peterson sold it out to expansionist French Canada. What then is English-speaking Canada going to do about what is being done to this country? As I said earlier, I have now spoken 20 times to organizations across Canada, to people who do care about what is being done. The best attended meetings were in Sudbury, in St. John, and in Moncton, where the people have good reason to see what is being done. In Sudbury, 1,200 people were present, and another 300 were turned away. Mr. Grandmaitre, Ontario's Commissar for an all-French Ontario, was aware in advance of the meeting and directed his Francophone legions to attend and break it up. They were there, but they didn't dare open their mouths. But I have also spoken to as few as 40 people, such as in Barrie, where the town, like Toronto and Hamilton and Mississauga, has already been designated for Frenchification because of its proximity to Camp Borden, and only 40 people were concerned enough to show up. What then have I learned from my 20 meetings? I have learned that the leaders of our English-speaking communities don't have the courage to as much as show their noses, let alone the courage to stand up and be counted. It is true that some of these individuals are providing money to those associations which are concerned, but the fact remains that our leading citizens don't have the courage to as much as appear. Instead, they are leaving it to retired school teachers and aging veterans of the Second World War to try and fight this war. But these people, as fine as they are, simply aren't enough, nor do they have the necessary political clout. What then do I see happening? I see one of two things. Either all thinking Canadians in all of our communities become concerned now and join together now and use every device possible to call an immediate halt to this Frenchification of Canada, an end to official bilingualism, and for the departure of Quebec, or I see the absolute end of English-speaking Canada within the next 2 to 3 years. At this point, the CRTC is already telling us what we in English-speaking Canada can and cannot say. Within another year or two, we will be told what we can or cannot think. Either all thinking Canadians in all of our communities become concerned now and join together now and use every device possible to call an immediate halt to this Frenchification of Canada, an end to official bilingualism, and for the departure of Quebec, or I see the absolute end to English-speaking Canada within the next 2 or 3 years. 6 months ago, a friend of mine who has been very active in his area in trying to awaken English-speaking Canadians to the reality of what is going on, said this to me: "I'm really beginning to think we are wasting our time trying to overcome the apathy that exists. As long as the average responsible Canadian thinks that someone else is trying to do something, he or she will be content to do nothing. Perhaps we should just give up on it and let Canadians get what they deserve." When I think of the millions of university-trained professionals across Canada who have presumably been taught to think and who up until now haven't made one move to help to try to save this once fine country for the sake of their children and grandchildren, I have to admit that I am coming very close to agreeing with my friend. At this point, I'm just plugging away until the end of 1989, but if Canadians haven't come alive by then, I may just conclude that English-speaking Canada is going to fully deserve what it is going to get. English-speaking Canada is going to get it right on schedule with Mr. Trudeau's timetable. In passing, I want to say that to my knowledge, there is just one man and one political party that are prepared to stand for one official language, English, with or without Quebec, and to mean it. That man is Mr. Elmer Knutson of Edmonton, and his party is the Confederation of Regions, or COR party. Mr. Knutson's original interest in politics was to try to secure better representation for Western Canada in Ottawa through an elected Senate which he believes should be based on regional representation. However, Mr. Knutson is now convinced that unless the Frenchification of Canada can be brought to a halt now, English-speaking Western Canada and all its aspirations for a more participatory future will, like the rest of English-speaking Canada, soon cease to exist. To that end, Mr. Knutson and his COR party fielded 7 candidates in New Brunswick, 13 in Ontario, and 30 in the Western provinces during the November 1988 federal election. In September 1988, our Canadian Secretary of State, Lucien Bouchard, said that if necessary, he will force English Canada's cable TV distributors to carry the new Quebec France French language super channel throughout Canada. If the cable TV distributors refuse to accept the new channel, the government will have the CRTC make them carry it. Our Secretary of State called the new channel the flag and the symbol of the new Francophonie. The new Francophonie can mean one of 2 things. It can mean the World Federation of French Nations, remarkably invigorated during the past 10 years by the input of billions of Canadian tax dollars. But when the Secretary of State uses the new Francophonie in the sense he does here, he means the new all-French Canada. In the eyes of our Secretary of State and our Commissioner for Official Languages, and most of the rest of the government in power in Ottawa today, English-speaking Canada no longer exists, except as a now vanquished enemy which now merely needs to be brushed aside. In the history courses which are a compulsory part of immersion French schooling, English-Canadian history no longer exists. It's been removed, just as English-speaking Canada today is about to be removed. Here is a letter from the Commissioner of Official Languages sent to a Member of Parliament in 1988. The MP removed his own name from the letter. On May 26, 1987, France's President Mitterrand spoke to the French Canadians in the Gaspé and said this: "You have succeeded in developing the French language in the worst difficulty so that it can grow and develop. For this is not only the language of Quebec, it is from now on the language of the northern part of the continent." I want to finish with an excerpt from a letter I have just received. It was written by Heather Carson, who is the wife of a Brockville doctor. Heather is very concerned about the future of her children, and she has been actively trying to awaken the people of Brockville to what is happening. Heather wrote this: I must tell you the story regarding the Coca-Cola bottling company here in Brockville. I went in to complain about the new French-only labeling on Coke cans. The supervisor, who could hardly speak English to me, admitted that the French intend to have the whole of Canada, and if I didn't like French only on Coke cans, too bad. I had better get used to it, because eventually there would be no English on anything. It's not a game that's being played for this country. It's the real thing. The time has come for responsible, influential, English-speaking Canadians to turn off their television sets, put down their books, and get involved. Once again, I'm saying it's your move, and now there aren't many moves left.